Hey everybody, welcome to assessment. Super excited to be learning with you today. This has been a very popular topic that has came across our desk in terms of asking for support and assistance, specifically in distance learning, but also as we transition into hybrid settings. And so really excited to be with you today. And I know there is a lot of experience in this room with others who have been doing this work. So please feel free to share as Carissa's sharing in the chat when you have additional experiences to offer so we can learn together. Many of you know Carissa, but she's amazing and she is quite the expert in distance learning and excited to lead you through this work today. And so Carissa is a principal learning consultant within Structure, and she currently supports Kern County Office of Education exclusively for as long as I can possibly make happen. So really excited to have Carissa with us here today to work with all of you. And with that, let's learn about assessment.
Thank you so much. And actually, that's a really fantastic segue into this slide right here, which looks a little bit different than our presenter slide looked like for the last couple of weeks. So I wanted to say almost exactly what Dr. Herrera just said right now, which is that there is going to be an opportunity specifically for you, those of you in the audience today, to share what you are doing to assess students during this time of distance learning. So as we explore assessment today, I want you to think about an assessment that you have given or that you have seen another teacher give, maybe in your support role to them, that you felt good about, that you felt was a quality assessment, or maybe even just an assessment that you modified specifically to respond to the need to deliver that assessment virtually. So keep that in mind. If you want to pull it up on your device or take a screenshot of it, that works too. We're definitely going to save some space at the end of near the end of our presentation to share some of the awesome ways that you are assessing or that you've seen assessments happen in your classrooms. All right. So I want to allow you to do a quick check-in. Oops. A quick check-in. So what I want you to do is, if you have the ability to use the annotate tool in Zoom, which you will see where it says you're viewing Carissa Duran's screen, there's a little pencil that says annotate. You can click that pencil and you can use a text box and you can actually type right on my screen. If you cannot do that, you can use the Zoom chat and I will put it over there for you. So I just want to ask you the question, what is your weather like today? So you can take that either figuratively or literally. And I would like you to just add right onto that screen or right in the Zoom chat. What is your weather like today? Excellent. I'm seeing windy already. Sunny, clear skies, and cold. That is a good way to walk into this session today. That's a bit the way I feel about assessment. It is a very sunny topic for me. It's actually one of the topics that I am most passionate about because of the enormous impact that it has on our students and the great maybe difference between what it looks like when assessment is done really well and what it looks like when it's not. What it looks like when maybe we struggle to implement all of the ways that we know are best practices for assessment, right? Because we know that assessment practices are pretty dang difficult to nail down. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about the ways to make it better, but also the ways to make sure that we can manage it as educators, because making it manageable for us is also important. We have to be able to avoid any version of teacher burnout or frustration as much as possible, because we want to be our best selves for our students. Okay, so here are our outcomes today. Our outcomes are really similar to some of the outcomes for previous sessions. This is first that we're going to establish some common language around our topic of today, which is assessment. We're going to review some current shifts in assessment, given distance learning. So some of the ways that people have been thinking about, blogging about, sharing about assessment during everything from the emergency response in the spring to this pandemic distance learning that we're doing right now, and then the thinking forward into the hybrid and blended models that we'll be returning to as we continue to prepare to sort of toggle on and off with the distance learning. We're going to explore some of those flexible and technology enriched assessment practices. So we're going to be thinking specifically about best practices in assessment, and then within that, best practices in assessment in distance learning. And then finally, we're going to connect with educators who are going to share how they are monitoring students. And if you were not here at the in the last slide, they, in this case, is going to be you. So we really want you to share some of your current assessment practices or assessment practices that you have seen. So another reminder, and I will keep reminding you until we get to that slide, as you're thinking about what we're looking at today, if you say to yourself, oh my gosh, I totally did that in my last assessment, I want you to go find that assessment, take a screenshot of it if you want, or just, come up with a little 2-sentence synopsis of it, so that we can share with one another later. Okay, so I want to start here. And I would love to know, maybe with a Zoom gesture or just in the chat, have you heard the phrase assessment for learning? So this is different from assessment of learning, but that phrase assessment for learning. Excellent. I'm seeing some responses in the chat. A lot of yeses. That's great. And a couple of no's, which is also great because it's awesome when we get to learn something new. And it's also awesome when something new we've learned can be affirmed by hearing it in another way. So I have linked on the side of the slide here, and it's also linked in your Canvas course, the Assessment for Learning Project website. It's really simple. It's assessmentforlearningproject.org. And this is where I got my resources for these next 2 slides. It's a super valuable resource. If assessment is important to you as well, it's what, your passion in education, I would encourage you to definitely peruse that website and learn even more from them than we'll be able to cover in this hour. So the Assessment for Learning Project has created a self-reflection tool. And this self-reflection tool is broken up into 5 categories for assessment. For the purpose of assessment for learning, they think that assessment has to cover or enable the conditions for these 5 items. The first is partnership. And when we think partnership, we're thinking partnership with our students. So assessment for learning, as opposed to assessment of learning, should be engaging to students as active partners. This means that your students are active in co-constructing, co-designing, providing feedback on, and influencing future design of assessments. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that assessment for learning is an integrated process. That means that it's integrated in your curriculum and in your instruction. It's, the main course. It's not just the dessert at the end of a meal. Priorities is the third dynamic here, and that is that assessment for learning should prioritize feedback and reflection. Notice it says feedback and reflection. It does not say grades. So assessment for learning prioritizes feedback and reflection, because an assessment of learning produces a grade, a percentage, a letter, a number at the end of it. An assessment for learning produces the chance for you to provide feedback, or rather feed forward to your students so that they can improve their learning in the next phase, continue to grow and be able to reflect on their learning, as opposed to just receiving a grade. The fourth element is product. So assessment for learning produces a body of evidence. And if you think about what that phrase body of really suggests, you might think of something like a body of water or a body of work, right? And it's multiple things. It's a collection of things. So an assessment or the practice of assessment in your classes should produce a body of evidence of learning of your students. It should not be just a snapshot of one period in time, of one summative assessment at the end of a 6-week unit, but it should be a collection of artifacts of their learning. And then finally, purpose is that 5th dimension. And purpose, when it comes to an assessment for learning, means that when you assess, your assessment practice should actually enact more equitable systems and learning environments. So your assessment for learning should not be punitive. It should be productive, right? Your assessment for learning should not point out what has gone wrong, but it should provide opportunities for leveling the playing field and helping kids all get to that standard of success. Okay, so we're going to do a little assessment for learning reflection for ourselves in just a second. I want to break out a little bit what these things look like on a continuum. So I'm going to leave the slide up for just a bit so that you can also look at some of those more granular definitions. And this is really what I just explained to you. But I want to point out that today in our session, we're going to focus on the 3 items that are circled here on this slide. So we're going to really focus in on this idea of assessment as an ongoing process that's integrated within our teaching and learning. This idea that assessments are going to generate rich and varied evidence of learning, and also this idea that assessment strategies should enact a more equitable learning environment. So you can see what these 5 dimensions look like on a continuum. For partnership, on the left, an assessment could be more adult controlled, but on the right, that's where we get to students as active learners. For process, on the left, we have assessment as an isolated event, and then on the right, assessment as an ongoing process. Priorities, assessment could range from being primarily focused on that instrument of delivery, like the mode of delivery that you're assessing in. And then on the right, you actually get to focus more on building a strong class culture and strong relationships so that your feedback is richer, it's more valued, more valuable, and students can begin to reflect on that. For product, on the left, the range is looking like assessment output as a score, and then on the right, that body of evidence. And then purpose, on the left, assessments are going to show inequities, but they're not going to correct them. On the right, assessment is actually a tool used to correct or disrupt disparities in outcomes. So these are the ranges. And we're going to take a moment and we're actually going to use a scale to kind of share with one another anonymously where we feel like we're falling right now in our assessment practice. So if you're in our Canvas course, that we were in just a moment ago, and you're looking at assessment, there's going to be a check-in question here. It says check-in and content sharing. And there's going to be a Mentimeter where you could actually draw that little dot and you can place yourself for each of those 5 dimensions along a scale. So you can access it there. I'm also going to show it here. So if you would like to just go to menti.com and use this code, for those of you that are not in the course or you prefer this, you can go ahead and you can put in those directions. And I'll give you a moment to self-reflect and self-assess your own current assessment practice. And just for complete transparency, this is where I scaled myself in February this year when I first encountered this reflection tool. Okay, perfect. So you still have access to this Mentimeter. So if you're one of those folks that is still reflecting and still thinking about it, you have time and it will continue to update on our course page as you continue to reflect. What I do want to point out and appreciate about our responses so far is that as a group, we have room to grow, right? And I feel like that's a really powerful place to be. If we look at the landscape of education and we see just the national landscape, our state landscape, even within our personal context, if we look at what's currently happening with our students, we know we can identify inequities that exist right now that are surfacing, coming up to the surface, and that are really revealing sort of the depth of the disparities that exist within student outcomes, access to education, and assessment practices. So when we as educators can reflect on our own individual assessment and we can establish that there's room to grow, that means that we are able to start to fill that gap, start to work towards disrupting those inequities. And that puts us in a really powerful position. When we think we're at a 5 all the time, and our students are not at a 5 all the time, there's a misalignment, right? And so I see a few head nods, so I appreciate that. And I think it's really just a powerful place for us to start. So thank you very much. So I'm going to kind of carry us through a little bit those three focus areas that I mentioned a moment ago that we are going to sort of zero in on. The first was the idea of an integrated assessment practice. And so I posed the question, well, what does an integrated assessment practice look like? And so I tried to really limit the list that I could have put here and focus in on just a couple of things that we can hold on to and that we can put into practice. So the first is that if our assessments are integrated into our curriculum and instruction, and they are part of the main course and they're not just a dessert at the end, your assessment should never be a gotcha, right? It should never have that feeling for students that they didn't expect that they didn't realize that X, Y, or Z was going to be on the assessment. There should be a really, really clear alignment, a coherence between what you're teaching to them and what you're talking to them every day, and what you assess them on. Their assessment should not be surprising. Every single day, something that you're teaching them should absolutely inform the assessment. And that sounds almost like a duh, but when we're not being super intentional about it, it's really, really easy to slip away from that. I taught for several years in an English class in a secondary school. And let me tell you, there were so many times when I got to the end of an assessment and my students said, Miss Duran, I don't remember learning that. And that's not a reflection on them when a dozen of them are saying that, right? That's a reflection on me. And so I had to go back and I had to rethink, was I really intentional about teaching that skill, or did I just assume they were learning it along the way? So assessments should never be a gotcha. The second point I wanted to emphasize was that when we are integrating assessment into our practice, we're really going to leverage formative assessments. Formative assessments are a really easy entry point for us into this assessment for learning practice. And that's because formative assessments are often smaller, they're more frequent, they're more flexible. And when we are doing that, we're able to build that picture of student learning that we were talking about earlier. The third point is that learning and therefore assessment is iterative. So when we are integrating assessment into our teaching and learning practice, we are going to treat assessments the same way we know that learning exists. Learning is iterative. We learn at levels, right? We know that, look at our standards. We know that we teach students the same thing in kindergarten that we teach them in high school. It's just a different level, right? That's what iterative learning means. And because that's the case, our assessments should reflect that. When we measure a student's knowledge or skills on a topic or on a standard, there are a couple of things that we can do to make sure it's iterative. We can give them multiple assessments on the same standard, multiple small assessments with varying depths of knowledge, or we can allow retakes so that as students' knowledge and skills grow, if they're more ready later to demonstrate a skill, we should give them that opportunity to improve a previous score. So multiple ways of demonstrating the same skill or knowledge, awesome. Retakes, also awesome. All right, but what does that look like online? So I want to carry out this model for the next few slides in posing those questions, providing some really simple answers, and then looking at just a couple of examples of strategies of what that might look like. So short, quick checks for understanding. So a CFU for me is a check for understanding. If you call it something else, please let me know in the chat. That way we can all get on the same page. But a quick, short check for understanding. Some ways we can do that online. Of course, most of us are using Zoom or some other conferencing platform, and most of those platforms have polls embedded in them. If you start your Zoom, if you schedule your Zoom in advance, you can actually also build your polls in advance, which makes it easy to pull up. But not everybody uses Zoom. And so some other tools that you could use, like the one that I'm using today, is Mentimeter. You can also use Canvas quizzes as a short, quick check for understanding. You can use Poll Everywhere. That provides similar question types to the Mentimeter that I'm using today. So there are a lot of really neat, quick ways to gauge students' understanding. But pro tip, if kids recognize that you're using a quick check for understanding at the beginning of every class period, maybe they show up 5 minutes late because they're tired of answering the question, right? So what you want to do is you also want to vary the questions that you're asking them in those times. So mix it up. You don't have to ask or assess academic skills for every single question. You can also assess your students' well-being, their social emotional learning. You can build relationships through fun questions. And so I would encourage you to use a quick, short check for understanding every single day and mix it up. Have some days where you have academic questions. How did you feel at the end of yesterday's lesson? And some that are fun questions, so that students and teachers can both build relationships and build an understanding of student learning. Another way that we can integrate this practice into our curriculum, into our teaching and learning, is by leveraging what a lot of people like to refer to as elevator pitches. If you have heard of that phrase, elevator pitch, as an assessment practice, go ahead and put that into the Zoom chat. Let me know yes or no if you've heard of that one. So what an elevator pitch is, in short, is students being able to explain something quickly. The idea is that if you're in an elevator and you see somebody, I don't know, somebody, you see Bill Gates in the elevator and you want to get a job with Bill Gates, you only have that short amount of time, those 45 seconds until you get to the next floor, to tell him whatever you want to tell him. So the idea of an elevator pitch is for students to be able to convey their understanding in a succinct way, short, quick, to the point, very informal, very low pressure, but quickly. And that's the difference between an elevator pitch and a more formal presentation of learning. So some of the ways we could do this in virtual learning is allowing students to come into a breakout room, or just into a video call with us one-on-one and having a short, quick elevator pitch, pairing them up and putting them into breakout rooms to do it with each other, or even in a whole group, allowing students to volunteer to give that elevator pitch live in their group chat. A couple of things that I want to say about that is that you have some tools that you can do. You can use Padlet, and you can use your Zoom chat or your Microsoft Teams chat or whatever you're using. You can use Flipgrid or discussion boards. But regardless of what you use for an elevator pitch, because of the speed and because you will have students with diverse learning styles and diverse learning needs, it's important for you to allow students time to brainstorm and write first. So if you choose to use elevator pitches as a quick check for understanding, make sure that you're building time for them to write it out. Otherwise, it can become more emotionally overwhelming than it ever needs to be. Also, make sure that you're framing it as something that is informal. It doesn't matter if their grammar is perfect. What matters is that they, have a brain dump. So one of the things that I really like about this is that when we're face to face again, we can still use both of these practices. If we're hybrid or blended, we can still use both of these practices. And it's especially important because if students miss a class, but you're able to post an elevator pitch on Flipgrid or in a discussion board, you're able to allow students who miss class to have another on-ramp to that learning and to be able to access that anyways, because they can access it asynchronously. So our next of our 3 topics is, what does rich and varied evidence of learning mean? So the first thing that I answered here is that students are tasked with demonstrating skills and applying knowledge rather than restating information. So the more well-known phrase to describe this is this idea of performance assessment. If you are a current practitioner of performance assessment, please let me know in the chat. You actively seek ways to allow students to perform a task as opposed to summarizing knowledge or doing, standardized testing. And I love that I see some head nods in here already. So the second idea is that students can show their learning excuse my typo. Students can show their learning by submitting more than one different artifact of learning. So this is part of what we kind of touched on earlier and what I'm going to show you an example of later. So this is the idea that students are able to collect evidence. It's kind of like if you were to ask your students, hey, did you learn what you're supposed to learn? And they say, yes, Miss Hawkins, I learned it. And then you say, prove it, right? And that simple idea of prove it is going to generate this response of, okay, what proof do I have? What evidence do I have that I actually learned it? And this is what we want to enable, is for students to actually critically reflect on the learning targets, practice those metacognitive skills and think about, did I really learn that? And what do I have in this body of evidence and all the work that I've done for Miss Danley over the course of the last 3 months? What work do I have that I can show her to prove that I've learned? And giving students the flexibility to do that, to actually think about that, to build that into your course, and to have checkpoints throughout the year where you can ask them to look back on all their work, find a piece of evidence of work that you're proud of. What is something that you've done that you would want to frame and put on your wall? If you had to pick one piece of work from this entire semester for your grade, what piece of work would that be? So giving students the flexibility to think about different ways to prove their learning is really, really important. And then finally, the end of an assessment is more than a score, it's a stepping stone. So when we're thinking about a rich and varied body of evidence of learning, we want to think about leveraging that evidence in a way that elevates students to the next level of learning, or that allows them to see, to identify an on-ramp to a new level or a new idea, or to make connections. And that means that we have to practice reflection. When we provide evidence, when we're in a court of law and we provide evidence, we don't just hand the judge the evidence bag, we have to explain it, right? And so this is the idea of reflection. And this is when we get to the idea of rich and varied evidence of learning. The evidence in of itself is not rich unless it's explained, unless it's reflected upon, and unless it's leveraged to give students access to a new level of learning. Okay, so what does this look like online? So the first one is portfolios of learning. If you currently use portfolios in your class, I just want to give you a silent round of applause. But I would love for you to let us know in the chat if you do use portfolios in your classroom. So a portfolio of learning is simply the product that we just described. It is a collection of evidence of student work that proves that they have learned something. I see a couple of yeses already, so thank you. There are some ways that we can do this really simply without having to dive into complex products or learn a new tool. We could literally get a Google Drive folder or a Microsoft 365 folder, and we can tell kids to put their best work in that folder. Share it with me. Simple. We can create a template, maybe a cloud template in Google Drive or in Microsoft 365. And we can ask students to fill in that template with evidence of their learning. Record a video of yourself. Take a picture of something that you drew. Write an explanation, right? So we can actually build templates for them, and we can give that to them for them to give it back to us filled in. So a portfolio of learning is literally just a collection of evidence of student work. And you can take that idea in a lot of different directions depending on what you're ready to implement in your classrooms. But pro tip, for those of you that are using an LMS, it is really exciting that you can submit a live cloud file to an assignment Dropbox. And once that file is submitted to a Dropbox, and it's a live file, like through the Google integration, for example, that student can submit the blank template. It's already submitted to you, and then throughout the year, throughout the semester or the grading period, they can continue to edit that piece of work, continue to add evidence. And this means that you can set everybody down, get them all to submit their one document, and then they would be able to continue to submit to that same, or continue editing that same document over a period of time, right? Flexible pacing, flexible timing. And then you wouldn't have to worry about having them submit 20 different assignments if they're just editing that one assignment over and over and over again. So that's one thing that's super time-saving tip, and makes it easier for kids to submit their work also. So the second strategy that I want to talk about are one-pagers. A lot of teachers in the humanities use one-pagers often, but it should not be resigned to the humanities disciplines. One-pagers are just a creative expression of student learning. So what a one-pager is a collection of text and images that students use to convey their learning. You can imagine how simple it might be for a student to explain their math thinking by writing out a math problem and using models or scales or graphs or captions to explain their thinking, right? So it doesn't have to be a collection of artifacts from the Elizabethan era and a reflection on the language of Shakespeare. It can be anything. And what it does is it provides a creative outlet, it provides flexibility. And because we're in this digital learning space, what's really lovely is that you can allow them to make a hyperdoc out of this one pager. And what that means is that they can link to other stuff. So if they want to have a video as part of their one pager, which is something you could not do with just a pen and paper, they could actually link a video into there. And then you could have this really awesome capture of students learning. It also builds agency, which is super important for assessment for learning, that students are creating what it looks like to show mastery or to show proficiency. One pro tip, try not to, if you choose to do this, try not to add any arbitrary rules around a one pager. What I mean by arbitrary rules is you have to have exactly 75% of your page covered in text and the other 25% covered in pictures. Or you can only draw your pictures. You're not allowed to take a picture from the internet. Rules like this are going to be more burdensome than helpful. And it's going to stifle the creativity, which is the intent of the one pager. So when we're thinking assessment for learning, if my standard has nothing to do with the percent of a page that should be text or pictures, I shouldn't add that onto my rubric, right? If I'm thinking about what I'm actually measuring, I don't want to add rules on top of that. So consider using rubrics to clarify expectations. Absolutely. But don't add rules that are unnecessary, especially in this time of distance learning. That is super difficult for students. We don't want to have them, chasing their tails, trying to format something when the point was creativity. Okay, getting off my soapbox. And then the last one, before I ask you all to share some of your learning, some of your assessments, is this idea of enacting more equitable learning environments. So the first idea is that we design for what's right and not for what's easiest. And let me just say, this is a hard to swallow pill. It's one of those things. And it's something that I wasn't sure I wanted to add on here, and then I did. Teachers are going through a lot right now with distance learning. It is difficult. And we know that we're still going to put our students first. We know that. It's why it's extra hard for students. We know that's why it's extra hard for teachers, because it's hard for us, period. And we're putting our students first. And so that's an assessment for learning practice. We're going to do something that might be a little bit trickier for us to figure out because we know it's going to benefit our students in the long run. That's what it looks like to intentionally work to disrupt inequities. That's what it looks like to mitigate the impact of, the digital divide that we're in. Is we want to make sure that we're really addressing students' needs. And so what that looks like in practice is when we see an inequitable outcome, and you know what those look like, right? You know what they look like, because we're going to pay attention to it. We're going to pay attention to disparities in ethnic groups or disparities in students in general ed versus students with IEPs. Or we're going to look for disparities between our native English speakers and our emerging multilinguals. And when we do that, we're going to adjust. We're going to pivot. We're going to adjust our practices to disrupt those inequities until they're not so obvious and not so predictable. We're going to predict those barriers, and we're going to scaffold, which, let me just say, is one of the most beautiful things about delivering teaching virtually, is that when you do predict those barriers and when you do scaffold, you're able to actually give students those scaffolds, those differentiated assignments in a way that is less visible to their peers. And the really awesome part about that is that we are not able to, in a moment, change societal stigmas around students with IEPs or students who are emerging multilinguals. But what we can do is we can eliminate the impact of that by making it less visible when they get a differentiated assignment. And technology really allows us to do that. Student A has no idea what student B is seeing on their computer screen. And so you can differentiate, you can provide scaffolds to different students, and nobody is any of the wiser. So try to simplify what you can, try to differentiate what you can. And when you do that, you are actively working to establish a more equitable world for your students. And that is heroic. All right. So I jumped ahead there because that's this piece right here on the right. But let me tell you what that looks like in practice. We're going to separate the need to know stuff from the nice to know stuff by simplifying our learning targets. So reflect on what you're teaching and what you really need to assess, and assess just those pieces. Your students are going to be fine, I promise. They will be fine. You guys are masterful teachers. You're going to continue to do an amazing job when you get them back in your classrooms. Our students will be fine. But what we can do right now to protect them is to simplify and maximize our impact by teaching them those most crucial standards. And we also want to that point, we want to leverage different ways for our students to be able to be assessed. And one of those things that we can do more easily, I think, in person, but which we can still do online, is leverage presentations of learning. And that's everything from the elevator pitch that we looked at before to a more formal presentation of learning in your classroom, or something in the middle, like a one-on-one conference with your student, where your student's able to maybe explain why they chose the artifacts for their portfolio that we talked about earlier. This might reduce the amount of writing that they have to do if you allow them to deliver that reflection verbally in a one-on-one conference. It'll also build relationships and allow you to connect with them and get to know them in a way that'll help them improve their learning later. So just a pro tip for that, just scaffold for your emerging multilinguals. That just means that when you assign a POL of any variety, whether it's an elevator pitch or a presentation or a conference, that you provide them with sentence starters and sentence frames and an outline, and you say, you don't know what to say? Here, start here. Here's 3 words to start with. You fill in the blank. And so that's super important when we're thinking about assessment for learning. If crafting that sentence itself is not your standard, and it's just the reflection or the content or the skill, you can scaffold all the rest of that, right? Okay, so one thing I want to point out before I ask you before I ask you to share is this idea that often rigor and compassion are defined as mutually exclusive, but we want to strive to make them go hand in hand. And that, I think, captures the difference between an assessment of learning, where we talk ourselves out of doing the right thing because of what's always been done or what other people expect us to do. And in the name of, well, that's not rigorous enough. And we want to design our assessments in a way that are powerful and meaningful and advanced learning. Assessment for learning is compassionate. So thank you for indulging me in that. Okay, so I would like to spotlight you. I would like you to describe a summative or formative assessment that you have done since schools closed. Something that you've implemented virtually. And like I mentioned earlier, it's either something that you would consider successful, or something that you have, regardless of how you feel about it, something that you have modified specifically to deliver virtually. So there are a couple of ways for you to share. There is the Mentimeter, which is here on the screen. You can also add your examples in the Zoom chat. And if you actually were one of those people that went and took a screenshot of it, I'm actually going to enable the editing on this slide deck for you to add a picture of it to the end of it, if that's something that you want to do. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that, and I will play some music, and then we'll see what people come up with. Awesome. So thank you for these responses. So I like that I'm seeing a whole variety of things. I really like what you're putting for formative responses, everything from flip grids to just a drawing, draw what you know. Things like that are especially helpful for our littles who have maybe a more difficult time doing some of the more complex assessments that we would be giving to our older kids. But a small child could absolutely use Flipgrid and just record themselves talking. I know this because I have a dear friend with a 7-year-old who loves recording Flipgrid videos and will just introduce her teacher to every single one of her stuffed animals on Flipgrid in the middle of an assessment. But drawings, videos, these are really exceptionally thoughtful, formative assessment practices. That could also be summative assessment practices, right? That's one of the things that we want to also think about is when we're assessing student learning, especially in a virtual environment, we can leverage the same tools with different expectations and different guidelines to do both formative and summative assessments. And one of the powerful benefits of that is that we're able to then reduce the cognitive load on our students because they're not having to learn a new assessment method or a new technology tool. They're just using it to tell a different story or to produce a different outcome. And so that's really powerful because then we're taking one thing off of their plate and allowing them to focus on the actual standards. Okay. So heading back over here, I want to just show you one example of a shift in one particular teacher's course this year based on those assessment for learning principles that we just talked about. This particular teacher has done standards-based grading and did scaffolding and differentiation and intervention and retakes and still didn't see that it was enough for her students in distance learning. And so what she did is she actually reimagined her assessments as a portfolio this year. And when she did that, she was able to add all of these items on here. More intentional design of formative work, reflections, checkpoints, relationship building, and has seen success to the extent that it's how she wants to do her assessments moving forward, period. Face-to-face, blended, hybrid, virtual portfolios is the answer for this particular individual. And what that looked like in an actual virtual class, that this is from this year, is that this teacher would state an outcome for each set of tasks that she did. She used warm-ups as a check for understanding. You can see the icons that were used in that virtual classroom to indicate, hey, I'm checking your understanding. And in that Spanish class, they used the warm-ups as a quick check for understanding, but then also took that a step further and used a Canvas quiz to check for understanding on a previous lesson. So actually testing prior knowledge instead of new knowledge. After that, students would engage in portfolio work. So she would actually have them do active reflection, metacognition on that portfolio work, would think about what kind of artifacts they wanted to collect. Do they think that that particular piece of work is good enough to earn them the grade that they want to earn? How else can they demonstrate their knowledge? And then as part of their assessment practice, made sure to actually make that learning visible by providing the answers at the end of the day or the end of the lesson to those checks for understanding. And the purpose of that is that it shouldn't be a gotcha, right? They shouldn't be surprised by what the correct responses are, but they should have a chance first to show how they got there. So I just want to show what that portfolio could look like. And I chose this example because it is the simplest example of a portfolio that is being done well that I've seen recently. And what that looks like is this simple page, this screenshot that I have here, which I annotated. All the annotations are my own. But their portfolio is as simple as saying, put all your stuff on a Google Doc. And you can literally see it says at the top, this will be the inaugural year of Spanish class using a portfolio assessment. But what they did is they allowed them to create their own project. They met with the teacher to have that project approved, to decide what their focus was going to be. They made a proposal. The proposal was meant to connect the learning outcomes of the entire semester to the grade that they hope to get as a result of it. They linked the standards, they linked the competencies, they linked the rubrics, as you can see here. They personalized the starting point. So they wanted to make sure that they had at least some work that was in line with all other students, just to make sure that everyone had a common starting point. But even that, they used personalized learning principles to allow them to choose one of the two items that they had crafted here. And then for the entire rest of the semester, students have simply been collecting evidence from throughout the semester. The teachers use formative work every single day, Zoom chats every single day, asynchronous work every single day. And then what they do is they say, include work that's going to demonstrate competency in the 4 areas that we're measuring, period. And what they're doing at the end of that is they're having them do a presentation of learning. Each kid is going to bring their portfolio to their teacher in whatever fashion they want. They can do a formal presentation, they can sit down and have a conversation, they can write it up, they can draw it, they can deliver it however they want. And they're just going to explain how they think that collection of evidence earns them the grade that they sought. And what's really, really, I think, significant about something that's as simple as the one I'm showing you here is that this teacher is allowing students to have complete freedom around how to deliver their reflection and their understanding. They are not adding any arbitrary rules on there. They're not requiring them to use a particular technology tool. They're really allowing students to leverage whatever learning they've done to earn a grade. And by allowing them to do this, they're forcing their students to reflect on the learning outcomes in a way that they didn't before. Before, their focus was on the assessment, the tool itself, and did I do this thing correct, instead of focusing on what did I learn. So when we're thinking about that, I just want to remind us at the end of this that portfolio assessments, presentation of learning, all of the examples that we showed, these performance assessments where we're not just having kids bubble in responses all the time. These types of performance assessments give us a really amazing, huge first step into assessment for learning. And on their own, there's varying levels of quality of performance assessment themselves. So when we want to dig deeper into it, something that we want to look at moving forward is that performance assessment should be equity minded. It should be intentionally designed, right? We want to make sure that we're designing these awesome assessments that we're going to design with some questions in mind. What resources do my kids have access to complete this work? How much time do they have? What is their learning environment looking like? How is that going to impact my expectations? And how is this relevant to them? When we're able to do that, when we're able to do performance assessment really well, we're able to break down barriers for our students. We're able to give them multiple on-ramps so that our diverse learners all have an on-ramp to the learning. And we're able to contribute to really the improvement of not just our students' lives, but the generational outcomes of their families down the road. So I just want to thank you very much for attending this assessment webinar. And I really appreciate those of you. I appreciate all of you, and especially those of you who are already planning in your minds what you're going to do next to change your assessments and to make them more equity minded. So thank you. Have a great rest of your week, and we will see you again soon.